Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Jack West. I'm a medical oncologist and the chairman of the Global Resource for Advancing Cancer Education. I am joined today by Dr. Suresh Ramalingam, who is a good friend of mine for over a decade now, and he is currently the chair of the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group, or ECOG, Lung Cancer Committee, which does a lot of the most influential work in the field of lung cancer these days across the country. He's also a professor of hematology and oncology with a lung cancer specialty and the chair of the Division of Medical Oncology at Winship Cancer Center at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. We're lucky enough to have him today talking about the important topic of clinical trials and particularly what patients need to know about that. And this is a really important topic because clinical trials are really the driver of every advance that we see in the field, and they depend on the patients to hopefully enroll and participate willingly and even be encouraged and eager to do so. It's really the pace that patients enroll and participate in these trials that controls the rate that we get new drugs and new developments in the field. Dr. Ramalingam has been a leader of many of the influential ones, and as the chair of the ECOG Lung Cancer Committee really has a pivotal role in seeing those flourish. This program is part of our series that is being done by a partnership of GRACE with Longevity Foundation.
Thank you very much, Jack. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be at this program and to have the opportunity to talk about clinical trials. Dr. West and I have been fortunate enough to conduct a number of trials in lung cancer. And the first thing I would say is we understand how difficult these decisions are for patients when they have to think about participating in clinical trials. We start by saying how appreciative we are for what you, your family members, and your friends do to participate in clinical trials and help move new cancer treatments to the forefront. I want to talk about what exactly are clinical trials, what are the type of clinical trials, give you some basic information about clinical trials, what it means to participate, what are some of the sources where you can get more information about clinical trials, and so forth. We'll talk about the process involved, and I want to finish up talking about some of the common myths that exist about clinical trials that often tend to confuse patients or make it harder for patients and their families to make up their decisions about participation in clinical trials. First, what's a clinical trial? Well, a clinical trial is essentially the final step that any new intervention, be it a drug or a device, has to undergo before it can be approved for use in patients with specific diseases. So, for instance, we have a number of drugs that are used to treat patients with cancer. And most of these drugs start off in the laboratory where they are tested in cancer cell lines. And then when they find that these drugs are promising enough, they move them to testing in animals like mice and some primates. And once you learn about the drug, you get a sense for how it works, how effective it is, how safe it is. Then the next step is to test it in patients. And you have to then see whether this actually works against the disease for which it's being developed. And once you see that promise, subsequently the FDA reviews the data with the drugs, they review the safety, they review the effectiveness of a drug, and then make a decision as to whether the drug can be approved for a certain indication or not. So the clinical trials processes themselves are very carefully controlled. They are designed to make sure that you eliminate as many variables as possible and make comparisons that are truly meaningful and truly free from major biases. And there are a number of checks and balances that are put in clinical trials in order to make sure that the quality of the trial is of top class so that the information coming out of the trial is truly relevant for our patients. This is going back almost 250 years to what we think is the first clinical trial that was done by Dr. James Lind. He was a physician who was working on a ship for the British Navy, and he had an idea that scurvy, which was at that point not clearly defined as to what the cause of this disease was, But it was very well known that people who sailed in the ship for a long time developed scurvy, which led to a lot of symptoms, including bleeding from the gums, lethargy, and so forth. So Dr. Lin thought that giving acid and purifying somebody's system might benefit this disease. So in the ship, he found that there were 12 subjects who developed scurvy. And he divided them into 6 groups of 2 patients each. And to one group, he gave them cider. The other group, he gave them elixir of vitriol, vinegar, seawater, and one group got oranges and lemons, and the last group got barley water. So there were just 2 patients per treatment intervention. And within a few days, the 2 people that got oranges and lemons got much better. And so goes the story that was the first time that we realized that vitamin C is helpful to treat scurvy, and now this is not a disease that's very common because it's easily recognizable and treatment with vitamin C helps. But this is sort of what a randomized trial is, even though none of us would agree that 2 patients alone is enough to determine what an effective treatment is. This goes on to show us that even careful observation and making some astute interventions could actually lead to important information. So when you talk about clinical trials, I'm going to focus largely about clinical trials conducted in cancer for this talk. Certainly some of the principles hold good for trials done in other diseases such as infections and heart illnesses and so forth as well. So typically there are 3 phases of trials that a drug has to go through before the FDA would approve the drug. But there are exceptions, and we'll talk about them as we go forward. We refer to them as phase 1, 2, and 3, and each phase of the trial is meant to achieve a certain objective. So phase 1 trials are basically the first set of experiments a drug undergoes in patients. So in other words, a drug has shown a lot of promise in the laboratory studies. It's now ready to be moved into human subjects. So that first trial we refer to as phase 1 trial. So it's a new compound that's being tested. Or you already have a standard treatment which you're trying to improve upon, so you want to add a new compound to a standard treatment. That would also be considered a phase 1 trial. Or you have 2 different compounds that are very active by themselves, but they have never been given as a combination, and you want to find out how they fare as a combination, then they have to go through a phase 1 trial as well. So the goal of a phase 1 trial is to see how safe a new drug is or a new combination is. So typically, you give a certain dose of the drug for a handful of patients, see how they do, and use that information. If it's safe, then you go up on the dose of the medication to see how the next group of patients do. And then as you increase the dose of the medicine, you try to get a sense for what's the safest dose of the drug, what are the side effects of the medications, and so forth. So the primary objective of these is to find out the safety and determine the right doses of these drugs that can then be used in next phase of trials. But we also look for effectiveness of a drug, even in phase 1 trials, to see what kind of diseases a particular drug shows promise in. There are good data that suggest that in phase 1 trials conducted in the United States that are supported by the NCI, the benefit is approximately 20% across phase 1 trials. And benefit means there is some reduction in size of the tumor, or at least there is some retardation in the growth of the tumor or progression of the cancer. So even though phase 1 trials are traditionally thought by many to not be beneficial to patients, one could look at these data and say there is some hope for benefit even in a phase 1 trial. So I show you an example of a drug that was actually FDA approved based on a relatively straightforward phase 1 trial. This is CRizotinib. And CRizotinib is a drug that's now approved by the FDA for a small subgroup of patients with lung cancer that have a specific gene translocation called ALK. We call this ALK-positive non-small cell lung cancer. And this drug was actually being developed in a phase 1 trial. And when it became clear that ALK abnormality is seen in a small subgroup of patients, the investigators treated a number of patients who had the ALK-positive disease with CRizotinib. And as you can see in the slide, there are a number of patients. Each bar represents one patient, and the height of each bar represents the change in the size of the tumor for that particular patient. So you can see here that all of these bars go downwards, which means the tumor went down in size, and a bar that starts in 0 go upwards would be a tumor that increased in size. So in this curve, you can see that vast majority of the patients, the tumor reduced in size anywhere from complete resolution, which is 100% reduction, to almost 5 to 10% reduction in size in a vast majority of the patients. So essentially, when this drug showed promise in 80 to 100 patients, the FDA felt that the information was compelling and the drug was safe enough for it to get what is called an accelerated approval. So this drug is now approved just based on a relatively large phase 1 trial. Now, this is a rarity. We don't see a lot of drugs approved based on phase 1 trials, but it's an example of how, if we know the biological targets and develop drugs in a very informed manner, we can actually hit the jackpot even early on. When I say jackpot, I mean in terms of how much benefit these drugs can bring to our patients. Now, talking about phase 2 trials, that's the next phase. You've done a phase 1 trial, you identified what's the right dose of the drug, then you take this to the next level to see if this particular drug at the safe dose is effective against a disease. For example, if we found in a phase 1 trial that a drug has some tumor shrinkages in patients with lung cancer, then you take it to lung cancer patients specifically and then conduct a phase 2 trial. And for phase 2 trials, efficacy is the main objective. So you want to see if the drug works against the cancer. Now, how do you define works? Well, it could be response rate, which means the number of patients whose tumors underwent a significant reduction in size. Or you can look at something like progression-free survival, or how long did the drug keep the disease from getting worse. Or overall survival, which is how long did the drug keep the patient alive from the time the patient received the drug. So typically phase 2 trials are done in either just one institution or a handful of institutions. They involve anywhere from 30 to 100 patients. Certainly there are larger phase 2 trials that enroll more than 100 or so patients. Many of the phase 2 trials tend to be non-randomized, which means all patients get the same treatment, but certainly there are examples of phase 2 trials that are randomized. In other words, you're trying to find out, let's say, 2 different doses of the drug that are available. You want to see which dose works better. Then you would randomize patients. Half the patients would get 1 dose of the drug, the other half would get another dose of the drug, and see which group does better. And based on that, you can decide what's the right dose of the drug that you can actually use for treating that particular disease. And the overall goal of the phase 2 trial is really to see if a drug meets a certain bar so that you can subsequently do a confirmatory phase 3 trial. That'll be the final step before the drug is approved. Now, there are also examples of drugs that have been approved based on phase 2 trials. This is an X-ray of a patient who had advanced lung cancer and was enrolled to this trial and received gefitinib, which is an EGFR tyrosine kinase inhibitor. Even though this is an old X-ray, this is from 10 years ago, you can see how there is a dramatic change in the chest X-ray of this person within just a week of treatment. All the white areas, which are tumors, actually have nearly completely gone because the patient was exposed to this drug. So this drug, gefitinib, was actually approved by the FDA based on phase 2 studies. It received accelerated approval, but subsequently, for a variety of reasons, the drug had to be withdrawn from the market in the U.S., but it's still used in the rest of the world for treating lung cancer. In the U.S., we have erlotinib or Tarceva, which is a drug similar to gefitinib that's being used. So this is an example of a drug showing promise in the phase 2 trial and therefore ends up getting approved by the FDA. Well, once you've got a drug through phase 1 and 2, the last step before you can get FDA approval is to do what is called a randomized phase 3 trial. So this is often a trial where you have to have patients receiving in one group the experimental drug and the other group the standard treatment. And you're trying to see which group does better. So in order to remove any bias, this is often placebo-controlled. In other words, patients may not know whether they're getting the drug or the placebo. And we'll talk about placebo a little later because this is often an area that patients are concerned about, rightfully so, whether they are going to get the drug or not. And in many instances in phase 3 trials, the physicians don't know which treatment the patients are assigned to. So we call them double-blind. In other words, neither the patient nor the physician knows which of the 2 groups or 3 groups the patients are treated with. And these trials are monitored very rigorously. The data is collected very carefully, and it has to withstand strong scrutiny from FDA about the data before the drug receives approval. And these trials often enroll several hundred patients, in some instances even thousands of patients, before you can find out if the drug or the combination that you're developing is truly beneficial to patients. Now, there is another group of trials called Phase 4 trials. These are done after a drug has been approved by the FDA. So if you look at a drug like, say, Avastin, it was approved based on a Phase 3 trial, but there are probably some areas where you need more information about the drug, and for that you do Phase 4 trials. And these are typically done to get some information about safety of a drug, or you want to know how does the drug do in a general population. When we do clinical trials, there are a number of factors that determine who goes on a trial. So it may well be that the patients are highly selected, and what you observe as results, we need to make sure it's generalizable and the same results are seen when the drug is used in the general patient population. So Phase 4 trials serve that purpose. So you might see this every now and then. Now, when you talk about a trial, you need a sponsor. So in other words, to conduct a clinical trial, it costs money, and there has to be a sponsor or a source of support. The cost of conducting a trial actually can go anywhere from a few $1,000s to several tens of thousands of dollars. And Phase 3 trials, by design and nature, are the most expensive trials to conduct. So if you think about a Phase 1 trial, to treat one patient on a Phase 1 trial, the cost could vary anywhere from $5,000 to $25,000, $30,000. And when you talk about Phase 3 trials, the cost involved in treating one patient on a trial could vary anywhere from $50,000 to $75,000 per patient. So you can imagine how much resources are required to conduct a trial. So even if in our own laboratory we find a drug that's very promising, for us to take the drug to patients and treat it, it requires several hundreds of thousands of dollars. And typically that's money that we secure by obtaining grants or by seeking support from some pharmaceutical companies or foundations and so forth. But essentially, it's always good for patients to be aware of who is the sponsor for a trial when they're participating. That gives them some information about the background of the drug and so forth.
Thanks for listening. If you like and learn from our GRACEcast, you can subscribe on iTunes by just searching for the term Cancer Grace, find podcasts and the subject you want, pick a format of audio or video, and then just click subscribe. It's that easy. And for those of you who don't want to miss any of our programs, there's even a feed for all subjects. You can also find us on YouTube at Grace for Cancer Info, and that's the number 4 in one word, Grace for Cancer Info. Finally, if you haven't been there yet, please check out our Grace website at www.cancergrace.org. And don't forget that donate button in the upper right. Our content, which helps tens of thousands of cancer patients around the world every month, is made possible by your support.